The forest was thicker than they had anticipated. Tall, ancient trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting together like the gnarled fingers of some long-forgotten monster. The afternoon sun struggled to pierce the canopy, casting the world below in a murky twilight. As the group pushed deeper into the woods, the path became little more than a faint suggestion of trampled earth, overgrown with brambles and weeds. "It should be just ahead," Darren called from the front, his voice tinged with both excitement and a hint of uncertainty. He was the one who had found the old map, tucked away in the back of an antique store, and convinced the others that it was worth the trip. "The map says there's an opening, like a clearing." Emily, trailing just behind him, wiped a sheen of sweat from her brow and scanned the dense undergrowth. "I'm starting to think this whole thing is just a wild goose chase." "No way," Darren insisted. "There's something here. I can feel it." The others, Tom, with his ever-present video camera, and Jenna, the skeptic who had only agreed to come because she had nothing better to do, followed close behind, occasionally muttering complaints about the heat and the bugs. But even they couldn't deny the strange allure of the place. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of anticipation that none of them could shake. Suddenly, the trees parted, and the group stepped into a wide clearing. The ground was oddly flat, the grass sparse and dry, as if nothing had grown there for years. And there, at the far end of the clearing, stood the amusement park. Or what was left of it. "Holy crap," Tom breathed, lowering his camera for a moment to take in the sight. The park was a ghost of its former self. Rusted gates stood partially open, as if inviting them in, and beyond them, the skeletons of rides and attractions loomed like forgotten relics. A Ferris wheel, its once bright colors faded and peeling, towered over the park, one of its cars dangling precariously from a broken arm. The tracks of a roller coaster wove through the air like the twisted remains of some ancient serpent, leading to a decaying platform. In the distance, the remnants of a carousel could be seen, its wooden horses frozen mid-gallop, their painted eyes dull and lifeless. "I told you it was real," Darren said, a wide grin spreading across his face. Jenna frowned, crossing her arms. "It's real, all right. Real creepy." Emily shivered despite the warmth of the day. "There's something off about this place." As if in response, a sudden breeze swept through the clearing, rustling the dead leaves and causing the rusted metal of the park to groan. The sound was like a low, mournful sigh echoing through the trees. Tom raised his camera again, the red light blinking as he began to film. "This is incredible. We've got to explore." Darren nodded, already moving toward the gate. "Let's check it out. Who knows what we'll find?" Hesitating only for a moment, the others followed. As they crossed the threshold into the park, the air seemed to grow heavier, the light dimmer. The world beyond the gates faded, leaving only the dark, silent presence of the amusement park around them. "Do you hear that?" Emily whispered, her eyes darting nervously around. "Hear what?" Darren asked, though his voice was quieter now, his bravado fading slightly. "It sounds like whispering," she replied, straining to listen. "Like people talking, but far away." Tom lowered his camera, his brow furrowing. "I hear it too. Weird." Jenna rolled her eyes, though she couldn't hide the unease in her expression. "It's probably just the wind. This place is old. Everything's falling apart." But even she didn't seem convinced. As they ventured deeper into the park, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. A mix of curiosity and something darker, like a warning. The group paused at the base of the Ferris wheel, its once mighty structure now a rusted husk. Darren craned his neck to look up at the dangling car high above, swaying slightly in the breeze. "Look at that," he said, pointing. "I bet it's been stuck like that for decades." Emily took a step back, the unease growing into something closer to fear. "I don't like this. I think we should leave." But before anyone could respond, the whispers stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, pressing in on them from all sides. The air was still, as if the park itself was holding its breath. Then, faintly, from somewhere deep within the park, came the sound of children's laughter. High-pitched and gleeful, it rang out across the clearing, echoing off the rusted metal and crumbling wood. Tom turned slowly, the color draining from his face. "Did you guys hear that?" Jenna's eyes widened, her bravado gone. That wasn't just the wind." Darren swallowed hard, his earlier enthusiasm evaporating. "Maybe we should just take a quick look around and then head back." But they all knew it wasn't that simple. Something had changed. The park was no longer just a curiosity, an abandoned relic of a bygone era. It was alive, watching them, waiting. And they had just stepped into its domain. The deeper they ventured into the park, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air was thick, almost tangible, like walking through a viscous fog that clung to their skin and weighed on their spirits. The eerie silence was punctuated only by the occasional creak of metal or the distant flutter of unseen wings. Ahead of them, a structure loomed out of the gloom, its once vibrant paint now faded and peeling. The sign overhead, barely legible through layers of grime, read, "The Ghost Train." The lettering, once cheerful, now seemed twisted and mocking, as if it knew the terror that awaited within. Darren stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the entrance. "This is it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We've got to check it out." Emily hesitated, glancing nervously at the darkened tunnel that led into the ride. "Are you sure? This place is seriously creepy." Tom, ever the documentarian, was already filming, his camera focused on the gaping maw of the tunnel. "It's perfect. This is the kind of footage that'll make people believe." Jenna, standing slightly apart from the group, crossed her arms tightly across her chest. "I don't like this," she muttered. "This whole place feels wrong." But Darren was undeterred. "Come on, we didn't come all this way just to back out now." Without waiting for a response, he led the way toward the entrance. The others followed, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and an unspoken need to see what lay beyond the shadows. As they stepped inside, the darkness swallowed them whole, the weak light from the overcast sky outside barely penetrating the gloom. The interior of the ghost train was a stark contrast to the bright, open clearing they had just left. The walls were lined with faded murals depicting skeletal figures, ghoulish monsters, and scenes of haunted landscapes. Cobwebs draped from the ceiling, and the air was thick with the smell of damp and decay. Old, rusted tracks wound their way through the dimly lit space, disappearing into deeper darkness. The cars themselves were small and claustrophobic, little more than rusted metal shells on wheels, with chipped paint and torn upholstery. They sat in a neat line, as if waiting for passengers that would never come. "Who wants to ride first?" Darren asked with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. He tried to maintain his earlier bravado, but there was a tension in his voice now, an underlying current of unease. Tom, ever the brave one when it came to getting the perfect shot, stepped forward, his camera still rolling. "I'll go," he said, climbing into the first car. Emily hesitated, then followed, sliding into the seat beside him. "I'm not letting you go alone," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Jenna shook her head, hanging back. "No way. I'll wait out here." Darren looked between them, then back at Jenna. "Come on, it's just a ride. What's the worst that could happen?" Jenna didn't respond, her eyes locked on the dark tunnel ahead. Darren sighed, then reluctantly climbed into the next car, leaving Jenna to stand alone at the entrance. With a creak and a lurch, the ghost train sputtered to life. The cars rattled along the tracks, the sound echoing through the cavernous space. The tunnel ahead was pitch black, swallowing the light as they moved deeper into the ride. Tom kept the camera rolling, his heart pounding in his chest. The track curved and twisted, the walls closing in around them. The ride was old, the animatronics barely functioning. Figures of ghosts and skeletons jerked to life with mechanical groans, their movements stiff and unnatural. But something felt off, even more so than it should have. The darkness was too thick, the air too heavy. As they rounded a corner, the sound of distant whispers reached their ears, faint at first, but growing louder as they pressed on. It was the same whispering they had heard before, but now it was clearer, closer. The voices overlapped, a cacophony of unintelligible words that seemed to seep into their minds. Emily clutched Tom's arm, her breath quickening. "Do you hear that?" Tom nodded, his eyes wide, but he kept the camera steady, capturing every moment. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if trying to tell them something. Suddenly, the car jerked to a halt, the lights flickering wildly. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of their own ragged breathing. They sat in darkness, the silence pressing in on them. "What the hell?" Darren's voice came from the car behind them, tense and shaky. Before anyone could respond, the darkness was shattered by a blinding flash of light. The tunnel ahead was illuminated, revealing a horrific scene. The tracks no longer led through the simple animatronics of a haunted house. Instead, they wound through a twisted landscape of real horror. The walls dripped with a thick, dark substance, like blood, and the ground was littered with shattered bones and broken toys. Figures moved in the shadows, pale, translucent forms that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. They were the spirits of those who had died in the park, their faces twisted in agony and fear. One figure stepped forward, a young girl with hollow eyes and tattered clothes. Her mouth opened, but the words that came out were garbled, as if she were speaking from underwater. Still, there was no mistaking the despair in her voice. "Help us!" The lights flickered again, and the scene shifted. The spirits grew more solid, more real. They surrounded the cars, their hands reaching out, their eyes pleading. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the air with their desperate cries. Tom's hand shook as he filmed, the camera catching glimpses of the spirits as they closed in. Emily's grip tightened on his arm, her nails digging into his skin. "We need to get out of here," she screamed, her voice nearly drowned out by the growing cacophony. But the cars remained still, trapped in place. The spirits pressed closer, their faces inches from the terrified passengers. Their mouths moved in unison, their whispers forming a single chilling sentence. "You can never leave." And then, with a sudden lurch, the car sprang back to life, jerking forward along the track. The lights flickered one final time, and the spirits vanished, leaving only darkness and the rattling of the ghost train as it sped toward the exit. They burst out of the tunnel into the daylight, the sudden change in brightness almost blinding. The train came to a screeching halt, throwing them forward in their seats. For a moment, no one moved, the echoes of the whispers still ringing in their ears. Tom was the first to recover, lowering the camera with trembling hands. Did that just happen?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Emily nodded, her face pale. "We need to leave. Now." Jenna, who had been watching from the entrance, ran to them, her eyes wide with fear. "What happened in there? I heard screaming." Darren climbed out of his car, his face ashen. "The stories were true. This place is haunted. We need to get out of here before it's too late." But even as they spoke, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the faint sound of children's laughter, fading away into the distance as if the park itself was mocking their fear. They had come looking for a thrill, but what they found was something far darker. The spirits of the cursed amusement park had made their presence known, and they weren't going to let their new visitors leave so easily. The group hurried away from the ghost train, their footsteps echoing through the deserted park. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to cling to them, a weight that grew heavier with each step. They exchanged nervous glances, but no one dared to speak, afraid that even the smallest sound might draw unwanted attention from whatever haunted this place. As they passed dilapidated game booths and rusted food carts, the air grew colder, the sunlight dimming, as if something was swallowing it whole. The once vibrant carnival grounds were now little more than a graveyard of forgotten memories. Torn banners fluttered weakly in the breeze, and the faint smell of stale popcorn lingered in the air, a ghostly reminder of the park's heyday. Emily, her face still pale from the ordeal in the ghost train, suddenly stopped. "Do you hear that?" The others froze, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the sound of their own breathing. But then, faint and distant, they heard it. The unmistakable sound of carnival music. It was soft, almost hypnotic, the kind of tune that might have once lured children and families to the games and attractions. But here, in the empty park, it was anything but inviting. Darren glanced around, trying to locate the source of the music. "It's coming from over there," he said, pointing toward the heart of the carnival. Jenna shook her head, her voice trembling. "We should go back. We've seen enough." But Darren was already moving toward the sound, his curiosity getting the better of him. "We can't leave now. We need to find out what's going on." Reluctantly, the others followed, drawn by a mixture of fear and morbid fascination. The music grew louder as they approached the center of the park, where a large circular plaza lay surrounded by the remnants of carnival games and attractions. The once colorful booths were now faded and tattered, their prizes long since claimed by time and neglect. In the middle of the plaza stood a towering figure, a grotesque clown statue, its paint chipped and its face frozen in a twisted grin. The source of the music was a battered calliope, its keys moving on their own, the notes spilling out in a discordant melody. The sight of it sent chills down their spines. "This is messed up," Tom muttered, keeping his camera trained on the scene. Who's playing the music? As if in answer to his question, the calliope abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing down on them from all sides. Then, slowly, a new sound emerged. Soft, shuffling footsteps, like someone, or something, approaching. The group turned toward the sound, their hearts pounding. From the shadows between the booths, figures began to emerge. They moved slowly, almost sluggishly, as if drawn by some unseen force. As they stepped into the dim light, their features became clear. They were people, or at least they had been once. Their clothes were outdated, tattered and torn, and their faces were pale, their eyes empty and lifeless. Some were children clutching worn-out stuffed animals, others were adults, their expressions vacant. But all of them shared the same hollow, mournful look, as if they were caught in a nightmare they couldn't escape. Jenna gasped, taking a step back. Who are they? Darren swallowed hard, his earlier bravado completely gone. They're the ones who died here, the victims. The realization hit them all at once. These were the lost souls of the park, trapped in a never-ending loop of their final moments. The spirits of those who had come to the amusement park seeking joy, only to find death and despair. The figures moved slowly, their eyes fixed on the group as they approached. The children were the first to reach them, their small hands reaching out as if begging for help. Their voices were faint, whispering fragments of their tragic stories. "Help us. We're lost. Don't leave us. Please, I want to go home." Emily's heart broke at the sight. She wanted to reach out, to comfort them, but something inside her screamed that it would be a terrible mistake. These weren't just lost souls. They were trapped, and the park was holding them here for a reason. Tom kept filming, but his hands were shaking, the camera wobbling as he tried to keep it steady. "We have to get out of here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is too much." The figures continued to close in, their movements becoming more frantic, more desperate. The air grew colder, and the dim light around them flickered, as if the park itself were reacting to the presence of the spirits. Suddenly, the calliope sprang to life again, its eerie tune filling the air with a renewed sense of dread. The spirits paused, their heads turning in unison toward the source of the music. For a moment, they seemed to forget the group, their attention entirely focused on the haunting melody. "This is our chance," Darren hissed, grabbing Emily's arm. "We need to move now." But as they turned to leave, the clown statue at the center of the plaza began to move. Its head twisted with a series of grotesque creaks, and its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light. The statue's mouth opened wide, and from within came a sound that was both a laugh and a scream, a sound so chilling it rooted them to the spot. The spirits reacted immediately, their desperation turning to rage. They surged forward, their once lifeless eyes now burning with a terrible hunger. The group had become more than just intruders. They were the key to the spirits' escape, or so the park wanted them to believe. Jenna screamed as the spirits reached for her, their cold fingers brushing against her skin. "We have to get out of here. They're going to trap us too." Panic set in as the group bolted for the edge of the plaza, their footsteps pounding against the cracked pavement. The spirits pursued them, their ghostly forms gliding over the ground with unnatural speed. The calliope's music grew louder, faster, as if urging the spirits on. They reached the edge of the plaza and darted between the booths, weaving through the narrow pathways that led deeper into the park. The spirits were relentless, their whispers now angry and accusatory. "Why did you come here? You can't escape. You're one of us now." But the group kept running, their fear driving them forward. They didn't know where they were going, only that they had to get away from the plaza, away from the music and the spirits. Finally, they burst through a line of overgrown bushes and found themselves in front of a large, decaying structure. A funhouse. The faded sign above the entrance read, "The Haunted Funhouse." The building was massive, its exterior warped and twisted as if the walls themselves were trying to escape. Emily gasped for breath, her chest heaving. We can hide in there. Maybe they won't follow." Darren looked back, seeing the spirits still emerging from the plaza, their figures growing more distant, but not slowing. "It's our only shot," he agreed, though the look on his face said he wasn't convinced they would be safe. Without another word, they scrambled inside the funhouse, the door slamming shut behind them. The carnival music faded as they left the plaza, but the whispers of the lost souls still lingered in their ears, a reminder that they weren't truly safe. They had escaped the carnival of lost souls, for now, but the park was far from done with them. And as they stepped into the darkened corridors of the funhouse, they knew that whatever awaited them inside might be even worse. The air inside the funhouse was stifling, thick with the scent of mildew and decay. The warped corridors twisted in impossible directions, with floors that slanted and walls that seemed to close in on them. The eerie silence was only broken by the distant creaks and groans of the old building, as if it were alive, shifting and breathing around them. They moved cautiously through the funhouse, the fear from the carnival of lost souls still fresh in their minds. Each turn of the corner brought new horrors, distorted mirrors that twisted their reflections into monstrous forms, and shifting walls that seemed to close in, forcing them to squeeze through ever-tightening gaps. Emily clung to Tom, her eyes wide with fear. "This place, it's like it's trying to trap us." Tom nodded, his grip tightening on his camera. Though the red light had long since stopped blinking, the battery finally drained. "It's like the whole park is alive, and it knows we're here." "Let's just find a way out," Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't want to stay in here any longer than we have to." Darren led the way, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of an exit. The fun house felt like a maze, designed to confuse and disorient them, with every corridor leading back to where they had started. But Darren refused to show fear. "There has to be a way out," he muttered, more to himself than to the others. After what felt like hours of wandering, they finally stumbled upon a door. It was old and rusted, with a faded sign that read, "Exit." Relief washed over them as Darren pushed it open, revealing a set of stairs that led upward, toward the faint light of the outside. "Thank God," Jenna sighed, hurrying toward the stairs. But as they ascended, the light grew brighter and the air cooler. When they emerged at the top, they found themselves on a wide platform, high above the rest of the park. The sky had darkened to a deep, ominous gray, the sun barely visible through thick clouds. The sound of the wind howling through the rusted metal structures was the only thing that broke the eerie silence. The platform was attached to the base of the Ferris wheel, which loomed above them like a giant skeleton. Its metal frame creaked and swayed in the wind, the once colorful cars now dull and rusted, some hanging at awkward angles, while others were missing entirely. We're We're on the Ferris wheel, Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. She wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to ward off the cold that seemed to radiate from the structure. Tom stepped forward, peering over the edge of the platform. From this height, they could see the entire amusement park sprawled out below them, a desolate wasteland of broken rides and crumbling buildings. "It's so high up," he murmured, his earlier bravado gone. Jenna shivered, taking a step back. "I don't like this. It feels like we're trapped." Darren's eyes were drawn to the Ferris wheel itself, and the way it seemed to be beckoning them, daring them to climb aboard. "Maybe this is the way out," he said, more to convince himself than the others. "We can see the whole park from here. Maybe we can find an escape route." Emily shook her head, backing away from the edge. "Are you crazy? That thing looks like it could collapse at any second." But Darren was already moving toward one of the cars, a stubborn determination in his eyes. "We won't know unless we try. If we stay here, we're sitting ducks. The spirits know we're here. They'll find us eventually." Jenna exchanged a nervous glance with Emily, who bit her lip, torn between the urge to run and the fear of being left alone. Finally, she nodded. "All right, but let's make it quick." The group hesitated for a moment longer, then slowly climbed into one of the more stable-looking cars. The metal creaked ominously beneath their weight, but it held. As they settled in, the wind picked up, and the Ferris wheel groaned as if in protest. Darren reached for the control lever, which was rusted and stiff. He grunted with effort, but eventually the wheel jerked to life, the car lurching forward as the giant structure began to rotate. The ascent was slow, every creak and groan of the metal sending shivers down their spines. As they rose higher, the park below grew smaller, the twisted rides and decaying structures fading into the gray landscape. But as they climbed, the atmosphere inside the car began to change. The air grew colder, the wind whipping through the gaps in the metal, and the light around them dimmed until it was almost completely dark. The higher they went, the more they began to feel an inexplicable pressure, a weight pressing down on their chests, making it hard to breathe. And then, the visions began. At first, they were just flickers, shadows moving at the edge of their vision, faces that weren't there when they turned to look. But soon, the flickers became more vivid, more real. Tom was the first to react, his voice cracking as he shouted, "Do you see that?" The others looked out of the car, and their breath caught in their throats. The Ferris wheel was no longer just a ride. It had become a window into the past. Below them, the park was alive again, but not as they had found it. The rides were moving, the lights flickering to life, and the sounds of laughter and music filled the air. But something was wrong. The park was distorted, twisted into a grotesque parody of itself. The rides moved too fast, the music was warped and discordant, and the laughter was high-pitched and manic, almost like screaming. As they watched in horror, they saw people on the rides, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and pain. The roller coaster twisted and bucked wildly, throwing passengers from their seats, their bodies disappearing into the darkness below. The carousel spun out of control, the horses' painted eyes wide with fear, while children clung to their manes, their screams echoing in the night. The group's car continued its slow ascent, and the visions grew worse. The Ferris wheel itself began to sway, the cars below them rocking dangerously as if the structure was trying to shake them off. The air was thick with the smell of burning, and the sound of metal grinding against metal was deafening. Emily covered her ears, tears streaming down her face. "Make it stop! Please, make it stop!" But there was no stopping it. The Ferris wheel had become a nightmare machine, forcing them to witness the horrific deaths of those who had come before them. The faces of the victims became clearer, their cries for help more desperate as they reached out, their hands passing through the metal bars of the car, as if trying to pull the group down with them. Jenna screamed as one of the spirits, a young boy with hollow eyes and a blood-stained shirt, appeared in front of her, his face inches from hers. "Help me," he whispered, his voice filled with despair. "Please, don't leave me here." She recoiled, her back hitting the edge of the car, but there was nowhere to go. The spirits were all around them now, their faces pressing against the metal, their voices a chorus of agony. "Why didn't you save us? You're just like them. You'll never leave." The car reached the top of the Ferris wheel, and for a brief moment, everything went still. The spirits faded, the visions dissolved, and the park below returned to its decayed, abandoned state. But the silence was worse than the noise, the stillness more terrifying than the chaos. Darren, his face pale and drenched in sweat, gripped the control lever, desperate to bring the car back down. But as he pulled on it, the Ferris wheel refused to move. They were stuck at the top, suspended above the park, trapped between the world of the living and the dead. Tom, his hands shaking, reached for the camera that had long since gone dead. "We're not going to make it out of here, are we?" Jenna shook her head, her eyes filled with tears. I don't know how we're going to get out of this." And then, the Ferris wheel groaned, the metal straining as it began to move again, but this time downward. Too fast, too sudden. The car jerked violently, throwing them against the sides as it plummeted toward the ground. The spirits reappeared, their faces contorted with anger and desperation, their hands clawing at the car as it descended. The group's screams joined those of the dead, their voices blending into a single, terrible sound that echoed through the park. As the car neared the ground, it slowed, finally coming to a jarring stop just above the platform. The spirits vanished, leaving the group gasping for breath, their bodies trembling with shock and fear. The Ferris wheel creaked one last time, and then went still, the wind dying down as the ride settled into silence once more. Darren was the first to speak, his voice hoarse. "We need to get out of here. Now." The group stumbled away from the Ferris wheel, their legs shaky and their minds reeling from the horrifying visions they had just witnessed. The sky above had darkened further, the sun now completely obscured by thick, swirling clouds that seemed to press down on the park like a smothering blanket. The air was colder than before, biting into their skin and adding to the growing sense of dread that enveloped them. Emily hugged herself tightly, her teeth chattering from more than just the chill. "We can't stay out here. We need to find shelter." Darren, still visibly shaken, nodded. "The fun house. We saw it before. It's close. Maybe we can find a place to hide, to figure out what to do next." Jenna's eyes were wide with fear, but she knew they had no other choice. "Fine, but we have to stick together. No more splitting up." Tom glanced back at the Ferris wheel, the memory of the spirits' anguished faces still fresh in his mind. "Let's go. The sooner we're out of the open, the better." They moved quickly, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence of the park. The fun house loomed ahead, its once bright facade now faded and peeling. The large, grinning face of a clown dominated the entrance, its smile twisted into something far more sinister by the passage of time. The door beneath it creaked open, as if beckoning them inside. Darren hesitated for just a moment before pushing the door wider, revealing the dark interior. "Stay close," he whispered, stepping inside. The others followed, the door slamming shut behind them with a loud bang that echoed through the empty corridors. The sudden noise made them all jump, their nerves already frayed. The interior of the funhouse was even more disorienting than the outside. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one distorting their reflections into grotesque caricatures. The floor was uneven, slanting at odd angles, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and rot. Faint, echoing laughter drifted through the corridors, as if the walls themselves were mocking them. "This place is a nightmare," Jenna muttered, her voice trembling. Emily nodded, her eyes darting from one twisted reflection to another. "We have to keep moving. There has to be another way out." Darren took the lead again, guiding them deeper into the funhouse. The labyrinthine corridors seemed to twist and turn back on themselves, the mirrors warping their reflections in increasingly disturbing ways. At one point, they passed a mirror that showed their reflections as pale, ghostly figures with hollow eyes, an image that sent a shiver down all of their spines. As they rounded a corner, the floor suddenly shifted beneath them, tilting sharply to one side. Emily stumbled, grabbing onto Tom to keep from falling. "What's happening?" Darren looked around, his eyes wide. "It's like the whole place is moving." The walls began to close in, the mirrors bending and twisting as the corridor narrowed. The distorted reflections became more grotesque, the faces in the mirrors now grinning with malicious glee, their eyes following the group's every move. "Keep going," Tom urged, pushing them forward. "We can't stay here." They moved as quickly as they could through the shifting, narrowing corridor, the walls pressing in on them. The laughter grew louder, echoing off the mirrors and filling the air with a maddening cacophony. It was as if the funhouse itself were alive, feeding off their fear, delighting in their terror. They finally burst into a larger room, the walls lined with even more mirrors. But these were different. Each one displayed a scene from the park's past. They saw the carousel, spinning out of control as children clung to the horses for dear life. They saw the roller coaster, its cars flying off the tracks as passengers screamed in horror. They saw the Ferris wheel, swaying violently as the cars plummeted to the ground. Jenna gasped as she saw her own reflection in one of the mirrors. Except it wasn't her. It was a version of her, twisted and decayed, with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth. "What is this? Why are we seeing this?" Before anyone could answer, the mirrors shattered all at once, the glass exploding outward in a shower of shards. The group ducked, shielding their faces, but when they looked up again, the room was no longer empty. The spirits were there, the same ones they had seen before. But now they were fully formed, their translucent bodies flickering like old film reels. They moved slowly, their feet hovering just above the ground, their eyes locked on the group. "Please, help us! Please, help us!" one of the spirits whispered, its voice a hollow echo. Darren took a step back, his heart pounding. "We can't help you. We don't know how." The spirits moved closer, their faces twisted with desperation and anger. "You must help us, or you will become one of us." Emily shook her head, backing away until she hit the wall. "We don't know what to do. We're just trying to survive." The spirits' faces contorted into expressions of rage. "You can't escape. The park won't let you." The room began to spin, the walls closing in again as the spirits advanced. The laughter returned, louder and more maniacal, as if the fun house itself were feeding on their fear. The mirrors around them rippled like water, the broken glass forming into new, distorted reflections that laughed and jeered at the group. Tom grabbed Darren's arm, pulling him toward a door that had appeared on the far side of the room. "There, that might be a way out." Without hesitation, they ran for the door, the spirits reaching out with ghostly hands as they passed. The air grew colder, the light dimming as if the funhouse were trying to swallow them whole. They burst through the door and into another corridor, the walls lined with even more mirrors. But these mirrors showed nothing but darkness, no reflections, no distorted images, just an endless void that seemed to stretch on forever. "We have to keep going," Darren said, his voice shaky. "We have to get out of here." They moved quickly down the corridor, the walls narrowing again, forcing them into single file. The air was thick with the smell of rot, and the floor was sticky beneath their feet, as if they were walking through something foul. The laughter continued to echo around them, growing louder with each step. The walls began to pulse, as if alive, the mirrors vibrating with an unnatural energy. The darkness in the mirrors seemed to reach out toward them, tendrils of shadow stretching across the glass. Finally, they reached the end of the corridor, where another door waited. This one was old and weathered, the wood splintered and rotting. Darren hesitated, his hand on the doorknob. "This has to be it. This has to be the way out." He pushed the door open, revealing a small, dark room. The air inside was cold and stale, and the floor creaked ominously beneath their feet. The only light came from a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. They stepped inside, the door slamming shut behind them. The room was empty, save for a single mirror on the far wall. Unlike the others, this one was clean and clear, reflecting their images perfectly. But as they approached, the reflections began to change. Their faces twisted into grotesque parodies of themselves, their eyes hollow and their mouths gaping in silent screams. The mirror rippled, the glass warping as if it were made of liquid. Suddenly, the surface of the mirror shattered, and the room was plunged into darkness. The laughter returned, louder and more terrifying than ever, as the walls began to close in once more. The group huddled together, their fear overwhelming as the room seemed to collapse around them. The darkness was complete, suffocating, and the laughter grew louder, more maniacal. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The walls stopped closing in, and the darkness lifted. The group found themselves standing in the middle of the fun house, the twisted mirrors and shifting walls gone. They were back at the entrance, the clown's grinning face leering down at them. Darren looked around, his breath coming in ragged gasps. What just happened?" Tom shook his head, his hands still trembling. "I don't know, but we have to get out of here. Now." They didn't wait for another word. They ran for the door, bursting out into the cold, dark air of the park. The fun house loomed behind them, silent and still. But the memory of what they had experienced inside lingered, a heavy weight on their minds. As they stumbled away from the fun house, they knew one thing for certain. The park wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and it wanted them. But as they looked around, their hearts sank. The park had changed again, the pathways shifting, the rides and attractions rearranging themselves into a new, more sinister pattern. The funhouse had been a nightmare, but it wasn't the end. The park wasn't going to let them go. Not yet. The air was heavy with an eerie stillness as they stumbled out of the funhouse, their breaths visible in the unnatural cold that had settled over the park. The once familiar paths were now twisted into an unrecognizable maze, the rides and attractions rearranged into something more malevolent, as if the park itself were alive, deliberately toying with them. Shadows moved at the edges of their vision, and the faint echo of ghostly laughter lingered in the air. "We need to find a way out," Darren said, his voice trembling with exhaustion and fear. There has to be an exit somewhere, but as they moved through the park, it became clear that escape wouldn't be easy. The pathways seemed to change with every step, leading them in circles, and the oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on their spirits. The park was a living entity, feeding on their fear, and it wasn't ready to let them go. Emily clutched Tom's arm, her voice barely a whisper. "What if there is no way out? What if we're trapped here forever?" Tom shook his head, refusing to give in to despair. "Number, there has to be a way. We just need to keep moving, keep looking." They wandered deeper into the park, their sense of time and direction slipping away. The once lively attractions were now twisted into grotesque versions of themselves. The rides rusted and decayed, their bright colors faded to dull grays and browns. The cheerful music that had once filled the air was now a haunting, discordant melody that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Eventually, they found themselves standing before the park's centerpiece, a massive, grand carousel. It was far larger than any of them remembered, its ornate, golden horses frozen in mid-gallop, their painted eyes staring blankly ahead. The carousel was still and silent, but the air around it hummed with a strange, unsettling energy. Jenna's eyes widened with fear as she looked at the carousel. "We can't go on that. We barely made it through the Ferris wheel. This thing, it feels worse." But Darren, his face pale and drawn, seemed transfixed by the sight of it. This has to be it," he said, his voice hollow. "The final ride. The park has been leading us here." Emily shook her head, backing away from the carousel. "No, Darren. We've been through too much. We have to find another way." "There is no other way," Darren replied, his voice tinged with a resignation that chilled them all. "The park isn't going to let us leave until we confront whatever this is. This is the heart of it, the curse, the power that holds everything here." Tom swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the carousel. The horses seemed to shift slightly, as if they were watching him, waiting. "If we do this, if we get on, what happens to us?" Darren looked at them, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "I don't know, but it's either this, or we stay trapped here forever." Jenna's hands were trembling as she took a step forward. "If this is what it takes to get out, then we have to do it. We've come this far." Emily hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest, but she knew they were right. The park had been leading them here from the moment they entered, and there was no turning back now. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's do it." Together, they approached the carousel, the cold air growing colder with each step. The lights that once adorned the ride flickered to life, casting a sickly yellow glow over the platform. The carousel began to creak and groan, the wooden horses moving slightly as if in anticipation. Darren was the first to climb onto the platform, choosing a horse near the center. The others followed, each picking a horse that seemed less menacing, though they knew it was a futile effort. The carousel groaned louder as it prepared to move, the horses rocking back and forth as if impatient. As soon as they were all seated, the carousel began to turn, slowly at first, the music starting up in a warped, distorted melody that sent shivers down their spines. The horses bobbed up and down, their eyes flashing with an eerie light. The ride picked up speed, spinning faster and faster until the world around them blurred into a whirlwind of shadows and light. The air grew thick, heavy with the presence of the spirits that haunted the park. The sound of the warped music mixed with the distant cries of the dead, their voices rising in a chorus of agony and despair. The group clung to the horses, their knuckles white as the ride spun faster, the park around them fading into darkness. Suddenly, the carousel jolted violently, throwing them against the horses. The world around them shifted, and they found themselves no longer in the park, but in a twisted version of it. A nightmare realm where the rides and attractions were warped into monstrous, terrifying forms. The ground was cracked and broken, oozing a thick, dark liquid that smelled of decay. The spirits were everywhere, their faces twisted in pain and anger, their ghostly forms flickering in and out of existence. They reached out with skeletal hands, their voices echoing in the darkness. "You shouldn't have come. You can never leave." The carousel spun faster, the nightmare landscape blurring around them. The horses' eyes glowed with a sinister light, their mouths moving as if they were whispering secrets too terrible to hear. The ride seemed to have a mind of its own, its speed increasing until it was almost unbearable. Darren shouted over the cacophony of noise, his voice barely audible. "We have to break the curse. We have to find out what's holding these spirits here." But the ride showed no signs of stopping. It was as if the park itself was determined to keep them trapped, to force them to join the countless souls that had perished within its boundaries. The air was thick with despair, the spirits' cries growing louder, more desperate. Suddenly, the carousel jerked to a stop, throwing them all forward. The world around them went still, the nightmare landscape fading into darkness. For a moment, there was only silence, thick, oppressive silence that pressed down on them like a weight. And then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a man, or what was left of one. His clothes were tattered and covered in dirt, his face gaunt and hollow, as if he had been trapped in the park for years. His eyes were empty, his expression one of deep, unending sorrow. He moved slowly toward them, his steps echoing in the silence. You shouldn't be here," the man whispered, his voice raspy and broken. "This place, it's a tomb, a prison. No one escapes." Darren stared at the figure, realization dawning on him. "You're the creator of the park, the one who built it." The man nodded slowly, his head drooping as if the weight of the world were on his shoulders. "I built this place as a place of joy, of happiness. But something went wrong, something evil took hold, and now it's cursed. Everyone who enters, they become part of it." Emily's voice was barely a whisper. "Is there any way to stop it? To free the spirits?" The man looked at them, his eyes filled with an ancient, deep sadness. "There is a way, but it requires a sacrifice. The park, it feeds on fear, on the souls of those who enter. To break the curse, someone must stay, forever. Only then will the others be free." The group stared at each other, the weight of his words sinking in. One of them would have to stay, to sacrifice themselves so that the others could leave. It was the only way to break the curse, to end the nightmare. Darren stepped forward, his face set with determination. "I'll do it. I'll stay." Emily grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "No, Darren, you can't. We'll find another way." But Darren shook his head, a sad smile on his lips. "There is no other way. I've led us this far, and it's my responsibility. If this is what it takes to get you all out, then it's worth it." Jenna's voice was choked with emotion. "Darren, please, don't do this." Darren looked at them, his gaze steady. "It has to be me. I'm the one who brought us here. Now I have to make it right." The man nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a deep, unspoken understanding. "You have chosen, and the park will accept your sacrifice." The world around them began to shift again, the darkness lifting as the park reappeared. But it was different now, brighter, the colors more vibrant. The spirits began to fade, their faces peaceful, their voices fading into the distance. Darren looked at the group one last time, his expression calm. "Go. Get out of here while you still can." Emily was crying, her hands shaking as she reached out to him. "Darren, But he shook his head, cutting her off. "No goodbyes. Just go." Reluctantly, they turned and ran, the carousel slowing as they left. The park seemed to guide them, the paths leading them straight to the exit gates, which creaked open as they approached. They didn't look back, didn't hesitate as they burst through the gates and into the forest beyond. The moment they were outside, the gates slammed shut behind them with a finality that echoed through the trees. They stopped, panting, tears streaming down their faces as the reality of what had happened set in. The amusement park was gone, hidden once again behind the dense forest, as if it had never existed. But Darren was still inside, and they knew he would remain there forever, a guardian of the cursed park, his sacrifice the key to breaking the cycle. The group stood in silence, their hearts heavy with grief and guilt, knowing they had escaped, but at a terrible cost. As they walked away, the sound of carnival music echoed faintly through the trees, a haunting reminder of the park that would never let them forget.